morning, everybody, and evening and afternoon, depending on where you are. My name's Laura Walton. I am a clinical psychologist and a scuba diving instructor, and I have a long-term interest in bringing the two of those things together, the psychology and the diving, in order to kind of understand partly to understand ourselves as people more through our diving, but also to bring psychology into diving to help us as divers in a variety of different ways. So today I'm talking about dive psychology as this new kind of emerging specialism, and as it kind of really is now, because it's a really, really new thing. And so I tend to think of it like emerging islands, and that's kind of how I'm going to kind of take you around as a tour today around these kind of little islands that are emerging in dive psychology. So I can currently see the messages just now, but I'm about to share my screen and I won't be able to see any messages. So what I'm going to do is run through the talk. If you have any questions, type them in, and I'll come back and check them a little bit later. And if you've got any questions at the end, I'll kind of come back and check those as well. Okay, so I'm just going to share here, so you'll be able to see my slides. Share. And okay, so as I said, the talk's about dive psychology and its uses, so basically how it can help you as a diver in various different ways. So I want to begin by taking you as a diver back to your very first dive. So can you remember, like, for some people it might be quite a long time ago, for some people it might be more recent, but can you remember like how that felt, the emotions, thoughts, the kind of new actions that you had to learn, the different kind of things like excitement or fear for some people. And that's what I want to kind of start at, because for me, the first time I was aware that psychology could help us as divers was actually my very first dive. So my first dive was on the Great Barrier Reef in 2006. And I never actually wanted to try diving. I was completely terrified and I didn't like the idea at all, but I kind of was traveling around the world, so I thought I'd better try it. It was one of those really busy boats, just kind of getting people in and kind of swimming around and then coming back out again. So there was very little time. And they kind of put me in the kit and kind of dumped me off the back of the boat. And I remember kind of putting my head under the water and suddenly kind of jerking my head back up. Because it was just an instinct. So I thought very quickly, like, this is obviously just an urge to kind of come up and breathe. I just need to transfer that urge over to somewhere else. I need to put it onto this thing in my mouth that's going to give me air. As long as I think about this, then I'll know I'll be able to breathe and go. So I did that and I went. And I actually really enjoyed it so much. I did another one and then went and did my own water course. So at that time, just that little bit of knowledge about psychology really helped me to just get in the water and get going. And even ever since then, every kind of little problem that I get, every little kind of thing that kind of comes up in diving, there's usually something that can help me understand it from psychology. So I've done that for years, and I've over time, as I kind of went into professional training, became a dive master and a guide, I started applying it much more to other people as well, and helping them to kind of understand what was going on for them and how to kind of get past these issues. So I don't think if it wasn't for psychology, I wouldn't be a diver right now, because it's helped me so much over the years. So as I said, it was from that very first dive, and I know that psychology can help. So as I said, through this talk, I want you to kind of think about you and your diving. So it's not just about the kind of psychology in a kind of theoretical way, but how it can help you and your diving, and to wonder throughout the talk where it might help you. So in order to do that, I might need to tell you a bit more about psychology. So psychology is the study of the mind or behavior, and it might be surprising to learn, but it's only been around for about 150 years. So psychology as a discipline itself is really not that old, as a distinct discipline. And a little bit about the history of that. Arguably, William James was the very first psychologist, and he was an American professor and psychologist. And in 1875, he wrote the first kind of courses in psychology. And then in 1890, he wrote some of the principles of psychology. So he wrote Principles of Psychology in a book. And his most famous kind of theory is combined with another academic, is the James Langer theory of human emotion. And that's about how human experience of emotion arises from physiological changes to external events. So like, for example, if you get a lot of water in your mask and that physiological change because of the change to your breathing then influences how you feel. And there's tons of examples we can think of from diving that kind of fit that hypothesis as well. Now, interestingly, one of the people, of the person who's commonly agreed to have invented the first open water scuba system is also called William James. This is a different William James. He's an English inventor, and he was around kind of 1825. He kind of put together this kind of design that kind of involved a helmet and cylindrical kind of tubes around the waist that held air. The dive didn't last very long. I think it was able to last about 7 minutes because there was very little air in there. And then, of course, probably a lot of you will know about some more of the history of diving. You kind of have the first closed circuit oxygen rebreather in about 1876, and then the 1940s and 50s, kind of Hans Haas and Jacques Cousteau, and kind of all of that kind of development. So without going into all the history of that, the point is that scuba diving and psychology as a distinct discipline have actually been around for about as long as each other. And when we kind of look at the timeline, there's an interesting parallels there. So we've got various types of scuba diving, as you know, various types of different types of diving, but there's also many different types of areas of psychology too. So, you know, kind of we have educational psychology, we have social psychology, clinical psychology, which is a type of psychologist I am, social psychology, neuropsychology, and so psychologically informed kind of areas. So, for example, human factors is probably one of the more well-known ones in diving now, that we can use psychology, sociology, various human sciences to help us understand and predict human behavior and kind of look at how that works in different situations. So you may notice over on the left that there's this kind of funny symbol. That's the Greek letter psi. And it's often used in psychology, especially by you know, our societies and bodies, because it's, you know, it's kind of the beginning of the word for psychology, and we use it a lot as a logo and a symbol. But it might actually look kind of familiar if you're used to kind of being around water and things. So take a second just to see, does it remind you of anything? So it always reminds me of Poseidon's trident, and I kind of think of it as that kind of way of, you know, this kind of psi being as happy in the water as it is kind of on the surface. So talking of Greek gods and language, to kind of give you a bit more about the root of the word, psyche is the human soul, mind or spirit, and the word psyche and it just means that kind of, you know, just that kind of our mind. And so it's used obviously as part of psychology and the study of the mind. So in 2015, I set up a website to begin exploring and sharing dive psychology. So that's, you can see, you know, why I chose the word psyche to kind of put together with scuba, to show how these two things are really kind of interconnected and really fit together and can help each other. To reflect how they go together, I called that Scuba Psyche. And at that time, I was just really looking for existing information, you know, whether that was media articles and blog articles or more academic articles as well, and talking to people. And actually, I found that there was very, very little information on psychology and scuba diving and all the different ways it could help us, you know. So I kind of kept going and just kind of wrote my own. So I wrote my own articles and courses and kind of kept going. So I kept going with this website, Scuba Psyche, from 2015. So why would I do that? And it's kind of been 5 years now. So why kind of continuing? Well, kind of to look at one aspect of that. If you think back through your scuba diving training, we can have a look at all the different areas that we learn about in our existing knowledge. So we learn about physics. We learn about kind of Boyle's law and Dalton's law, and we understand the way that that gases are affected underwater, because that's really useful for us in planning dives and then translating into our practice. We learn about chemistry and kind of the different elements that are around and how they kind of then affect our body. And we learn a lot about our lungs and our ears and how we protect those. So we learn about biology. And we also learn a bit about equipment. We learn about the kind of mechanics of equipment. So there's kind of mechanics and engineering in there too. And we learn a bit more, this is more physics, understanding refraction, but it's also kind of understanding kind of how light works in the brain as well. And we'd often learn as well a bit about geography, tides, and the kind of things we need to be able to plan our dives. We learn a little bit of all of that, even from open water training. And obviously it builds up as we go. We learn a little bit of all of that, except for the one science that helps us to understand ourselves as divers. So the one science that would help us to kind of understand kind of, the things that we do, just there's very, very little of it. So I see that there's a big hole here. An activity in diving, this is an activity where our actions, our decisions, our reactions, our behavior, they so strongly affect our enjoyment and our safety within the activity. So where is that one discipline that helps us to understand what makes us do what we do as divers? So I see this big hole. And so having noticed that, this is kind of me for the last 5 years or so, kind of trying to work out what goes in this hole and discover more. So I've been doing that by kind of researching, talking to divers, observing, and, kind of just figuring out what I can. And I also kind of work independently as well, but I'll come back to that in a sec. So yeah, so I've been doing all of those things for a while, and in that time I've obviously been meeting a few more people who are doing the same. So you might be able to think of yourselves a few more people who are kind of involved in psychology or human factors or kind of some of these areas. There's actually quite a lot of different but interrelated areas. So like I said before, I tend to think of these kind of emerging islands within diving or within psychology that are kind of the beginnings of this discipline. So now I kind of want to give you a tour around these little islands. So where is psychology emerging in diving? So the first part of that is looking maybe at the research, kind of up in the top corner here, where the boat is starting. We have dive psychology research. So there's actually very little of that. There's some very famous kind of research back from kind of in the 70s by a psychologist called Alan Badley. He's very, very famous for describing working memory. So you probably know the term working memory. He's kind of, him and his team were the people who kind of put that term together and understood how that worked. And he actually did quite a few studies with divers. And one of them was really interesting, that he had people remember words either underwater or on the surface, sort of memorize them, and then go into one or other of the environments and see if they could recall the words. And what he found was really interesting, because he found that if you learned the words underwater, you were better at remembering them underwater. And if you learned them on the surface, you were better at remembering them on the surface. But if you learned them underwater and then came up to the surface, you were actually worse at remembering them slightly. And this is called context-dependent forgetting, and it's something that's really interesting that we've learned from studies in diving about how our memory works. You might notice this on a more everyday basis when you get up and walk from one room into another to get something and then forget what it is that you were going for when you went there. That's context-dependent forgetting, which was discovered partly through diving. And obviously there's been a few studies around anxiety, a little bit on narcosis as well, but actually very, very little. But in 2018, there was a really nice summary that was put together by a group of Polish researchers working across a few different universities and organizations. And they wrote about the psychological aspects of diving in selected theoretical and research perspectives. And what they did was they basically had a look around at what was already there, a bit like I do, and then they presented selected reports from around the world relating to dive psychology, and kind of looking at explaining various mechanisms for psychological functioning underwater. So some of the things they looked at were cognitive functions, that's thinking skills, decision making, like I was talking about before, memory, personality and individual differences, the clinical applications, and in particular anxiety and post-traumatic stress, occupational psychology and sports psychology. So they looked at all these different areas just to see what the state of things were. And as I said, they were concluding that there were kind of big gaps, places that we really need a lot more research and that could help us in different areas. But one of the things they kind of said towards the end was that it can be optimistically stated that world literature provides an increasing number of reports connected with the mental functioning of divers, and to a certain extent, the new psychological discipline, diving psychology, has become more established. So this is something that's really exciting and interesting for me as a psychologist, because I started looking at this in maybe around 2015, a bit earlier, to see that kind of in a scientific journal that people are now starting to describe it as a new psychological discipline. And it's slowly becoming more kind of established and useful. So, yeah, one of the main reasons this research is so useful is because of the areas that can help us. So kind of going back to our little tour, you'll see the next island on from dive psychology research, which was incident and accident analysis, because we can actually learn a huge amount from studying people's behavior and their thinking and their emotional states when these accidents happen. Although actually when you look at accident and incident reports, there's very little data on that side of things. So we often tend to miss quite a lot. And obviously this is the area that can then be translated into disciplines like human factors that can help us as divers by changing the systems to make things safer. But that's not necessarily one of my more familiar islands. I'm kind of moving on to where I kind of sit a little bit more, which is the kind of clinical aspect and being able to help people who are having difficulties relating to their diving. So, people sometimes get really stuck with anxiety, sometimes very stuck on something very specific as well, and maybe don't know what to do about that or who to talk to because there isn't anything obvious out there. Sometimes stress, burnout. I work with professionals occasionally who are working as diving professionals, and there's a big element of stress and burnout, and it sometimes gets kind of pinned into the underwater stuff. And then when you talk to people and work out, you realize actually it's not quite all about the underwater situations. And there's various things I do around that, and I'm able to do as a clinical psychologist, because my main profession is working with people who have psychological issues and difficulties. So I will come on to that just now. That is what I do. As a clinical psychologist and a scuba diving instructor who's got interests in understanding dive psychology, within my clinical practice, I kind of offer this specialism for divers, which is supportive therapy following diving incidents. So that might be underwater panic, but it might not be even a significant external event, but it might be the fallout from the panic with a significant impact, distressing experiences, and traumatic incidents. And also, it's not just when something really terrible's happened. Sometimes people just get really stuck, and it kind of builds up and gets worse. Quite frequently when I see people, they might have been doing like hundreds of dives with this one issue, and it's just not shifting, and they've tried lots of different things, and it's just got really stuck. And as a psychologist, I can see what's been happening in order to generate that stuckness, and we can kind of figure that out and then make slight changes to then kind of get moving forward again. Obviously, some people have really specific fears and phobias, and obviously some of this, there's some areas of this which is going to be, actually, it's maybe worth taking a break from diving and addressing these issues first. But actually, more often than that, the people I'm seeing are actually perfectly fine. They're not. It's not always mental health issues. Sometimes they are fine, and it's just about understanding how our behaviour works, and dealing with unhelpful, distressing, negative thoughts. So sometimes we get hooked and stuck in certain kind of ways of thinking that don't help us progress in diving. So that's the kind of clinical aspects of it. So that's what I do. And that was initially something I really dismissed kind of back in 2015 when I was looking at how I could help divers, because it's actually really rare that people need lots of support following incidences and things like that, which is a good thing. But diving is a really small niche. So there's such a small number of people in a local area that would need that. Then I spoke to a few psychologists who tried it, and they get maybe one person every 2 years. So that's a problem if you want to specialise, because if you're going to specialise, you need to spend lots of time reading and studying and understanding what's going on for people. And to dedicate that time, you kind of need a few people to learn from as well, to work out what's really affecting people and then what works for them. But now, because of the possibility of working online, as we are now, it becomes much different. So now the geographical aspect just isn't a barrier. So there's a possibility to have enough experience to then build that specialism. So that allows me to kind of see enough people to make it viable to kind of learn more about it. And this is an area I'm going to do a bit more in detail in an article I'm drafting for In-Depth magazine. So I'm going to kind of go a little bit more into the clinical aspects there, because I just want to move on to the next bit, which is the fact that prevention is actually much better than cure. So I'd much rather be working with people to kind of help with these issues before they actually become a problem. So I realised that individual support as a psychologist isn't always that accessible. There's possibilities around insurance and things like that, but it's not always accessible to have one-to-one work. So I've been, over the last few years, building ways to kind of help divers learn about psychology and how it can help them in a much more kind of accessible and cost-effective format. So that's where kind of a lot of the courses that I make come in. So in the last few years, I've made quite a few online courses that are around kind of helping people understand aspects of psychology that can help their diving. The first two there on the left side are deep breathing and mental rehearsal. And the reason for that is these are the two skills, the two psychological, physiological skills that have been actually assessed in divers and have found to help divers in reducing their anxiety and improving performance. So deep breathing kind of explains kind of the benefits of proper breathing and explains exactly what deep breathing means, because obviously if you breathe a big breath, you're going to end up on the surface. So it's about kind of connecting it with the buoyancy as well. And mental rehearsal is about how to perform the skill of mental rehearsal and then use that for any new dive skill that you want to learn. And then the kind of bigger courses, the one at the top there is Prevent Panic, which is around understanding what panic is and why we get so stuck with it sometimes, and then ways of kind of preventing it and really reducing the risk, because you can never fully prevent something like a behaviour happening, but you can do an awful lot to reduce the risks. And that was what a lot of my talk was about yesterday, if anybody came along to that. And then ScubaFlex is the new thing I'm doing that I'm really, really excited about, which is actually just very, very small group formats to learn some of the psychological flexibility skills. So the most obvious one that you might connect with is this idea when something kind of comes up in our mind as a problem, the what ifs, if you like, kind of at the deeper part of your dive and suddenly you have the what if kind of creep in. It's the skill of detaching from that and focusing on the kind of current situation and doing what matters rather than kind of getting dragged along by the anxiety attached to that thought, because we don't kind of need that when we're kind of in those situations. So that's the one that's kind of just new and under development. So heading again back to the last bit of our tour. So that's kind of looking at preventive psychology, even into performance psychology there, and the kind of skills that we can learn. But then the next part is actually, I think, as I said before, there's kind of a place for psychology in diver education and training, and there's not a lot of it. It would really help us in terms of understanding to be, it's things like understanding task loading, situational awareness. I know Paddy brought that into the advanced course very, very recently, but there's definitely kind of places for that. And also how we learn and helping divers understand better kind of effective techniques for learning and being more confident and competent in their diving. So I think there's a place for it in dive education as well, in the same way that we have kind of the physics and the chemistry and the mechanics of it kind of filtering all the way through. So in order to tackle that, back in 2015, the route I was able to do that by was the specialty route within Paddy. So I wrote my own specialty on the psychology of diving. So it actually comes in two parts. There's e-learning part, psychology for scuba divers, which actually anybody can do, and it doesn't have to be attached to the specialism. But it actually also functions as the e-learning for Paddy Psychological Diver, which is a whole distinctive specialty to essentially learn all of the stuff that's helped me, as I said at the beginning, through the diving career. It's all the theory that I've been drawing on, put in one place. And kind of finally going back there, I think a lot of this still needs to come back to the dive psychology and the research side of things. Okay, so that's the end of our very fast tour around these little emerging islands of psychology. So thank you for going on this tour, and I hope you see kind of how these islands are emerging and developing, and think of them as places that you can come to visit. But as divers, of course, we know, I've given you this kind of little tour around on the surface, but actually, as we know, there's a lot more to explore here under the surface. So I think in the next few years, we're going to see more and more kind of coming out around dive psychology and how it can help us. And if you'd like to kind of get in touch, the place to do that is on my website on Scuba Psyche. There's my email and contact details and all of that there. So I'm going to just stop the sharing now because I've got about 2 or 3 minutes left to check the questions. So I'll go and see if anybody's asked any questions here now. Okay. Okay, I'm not seeing any at the minute. Has anybody got any questions? I'll wait a little while because I know there's a delay. Ah, okay. So yeah, Mike and Samantha, yeah, thank you for that. It's just personality is a really contentious area in psychology. Some people think it's really unhelpful to kind of have these categories for personality and kind of get stuck in these labels, and some people don't. I think there is lots of links. I find it kind of, as long as we treat these categories as they are kind of intended and how they are useful. They can be quite interesting. The Myers-Briggs ones I've not actually seen so much of, the Myers-Briggs classification. The ones that I find quite helpful are the ones that come from Honey and Mumford, which are about looking at what kind of style we have in terms of, are we theorists, are we activists, are we so basically doers, thinkers, reflectors. And that can be quite interesting in terms of our learning. So some people get really kind of more comfortable in certain places in their learning, and you see that as a diving instructor. I'm sure there's instructors who know exactly what I'm talking about here. You get people who really want to sit with the books and really kind of just are comfortable in that space and always asking questions, want to know how everything works before actually doing anything. And then you got all those people who just want to get in the water and do stuff, and then it's actually quite hard work to get people to understand the theory, because we're often just more comfortable at different points. But when you really look at the evidence for this, actually the evidence is that we're all learning best as we move through those cycles. So we all have to kind of do a bit of all of it to kind of make progress. So yeah, that would be one of the areas that first comes to mind when we think about personality. There's another one that's quite interesting that somebody's looking into. There's a researcher in South Africa called Charles van Wyk. Vic, I'm not quite sure how to say it. He's quite interested in narcosis, and he's kind of done a little bit of research around could there be an impact around personality in narcosis. So yeah, Mike and Samantha see that. You work in learning disabilities and see that. So that's our kind of learning styles. But yeah, the personality link there as well. Okay. So any other questions? I think we're just at 8:30 now, so I'm expecting an organizer to come and tell me we're finished. As I said, if there's any other questions, I might go open and hang over on my booth so you could come and ask me over there for a little bit. Okay, thank you, Bex. So thanks for coming along, everybody, and I hope I've managed to kind of show you some of the really interesting things that we have in dive psychology. Thank you, Paris. Nice to see you again. Okay, thank you. I'm going to head off in case people are needing to get over here. Okay, thank you very much. See you later. Bye.